Earlier this year, my uncle was gracious enough to bequeath to me his old Delta cabinet saw. Now, despite being old, this Unisaw is still in great shape. It has a 3 horsepower motor that runs off of 220, but my garage wasn't wired for 220. So I had to add a 220 outlet, which wasn't particularly hard to do. However, I'd recommend getting as much advice as possible before doing it yourself, because the shock from 220 isn't exactly a little tickle, or so I'm told. Anyhow, I got the outlet wired and plugged the table saw in, only to find out that it was tripping the breaker. Other tools that I have that run off a 220 weren't tripping the breaker, so I decided to take the entire thing apart, since I wasn't using it anyhow, and see if I could solve my problem with a deep clean. So I took the extension off, as well as the fence system, the motor, which was extremely heavy, and then I took the entire tabletop off in order to clean it and all the guts of the cabinet. Did I mention that the motor was heavy?
Now it's time to clean.
From there, I resurfaced the extension with a new piece of plywood. As you can see, I'm tracing the curve of the wings so that I can replicate the curve on the extension. Now, this is a nice saw, and I wanted to make sure it gave me nice results, so you can see that I'm taking my time getting the tabletop square to the blade. Then I set about trying to set the saw back up, knowing that I'd eventually make a stand for it so that it would sit level with my other workstations. My other table saw sits at 41 inches tall, which is a really nice height for me, but this thing, as you can see, is much shorter. Well, somewhere in there I realized that the dust and buildup were not the problem. It was my motor, so I knew I'd need to send it in for repairs. In the meantime, I decided to go ahead and make the stand. I wanted the stand to be somewhat mobile, which meant that it needed to be as light as possible because the saw itself was so darn heavy. So I used 1/2 and 3/4 inch plywood with these 4x4 blocks as legs. I'd seen a few examples of stands lifted up off the ground with a simple pedal push, so that's what I aimed to make. I needed adjustable feet so that I could level the stand to any surface, so I turned the plywood on the lathe. Sorry I lost the footage, but I guarantee it was funny. I drilled holes through those rounded feet and pounded 3 or 4 inch bolts through them, then capped the feet with another piece of plywood that I sanded to the same diameter. That allowed me to have a screw on foot that could be twisted to raise or lower the 6 points of the table. Now this is where it gets interesting. I took some scrap wood, some old hinges, and some old casters and fashioned a lever mechanism that would allow me to engage the casters just by pressing down on some pedals. I knew that in addition to strong feet, I needed more than just 3/4 inch ply to support the weight of the saw, so I cut some strips and half-lapped them along the bottom of the base for more rigidity. It looks pretty decent on film, but the weight of that saw is just too much for the scrap wood to handle. The lever mechanism kind of works, but the back wheel directly underneath the saw barely engages the ground because the plywood that it hinges on is buckling under the weight of the saw. So in time, I think I'm going to go back and re-engineer that caster system. At this point, I'm about stuck and had to figure out what was going on with my motor. I took it into an electric motor repair company, and $78 later I had a working 3 horsepower motor. Apparently it had a bad capacitor, which I could have replaced for about $10, assuming I'd known that it was a bad capacitor, which I didn't, or what the capacitor was, which I didn't. Anyhow, I wired everything back up and fired up the working motor for the first time, and man, it was a sweet sound. From there, it was just a matter of propping up my extension and reinstalling the fence before I had a fully functional tool. I'll end the video here with a working cabinet saw, but stay tuned for my next video where I'll be adding some drawers beneath the saw extension. Thanks for watching.